All right, this is my educational research article presentation. I kind of did it in the form of a PowerPoint. I just thought that would be much easier to follow along, and I will just kind of be narrating as I go through. All right, so what am I covering? Um, there are four main components to this little presentation. First one is my research problem and research questions. I don't know what my context and unit of analysis, methodology, and findings from data. All right, my research problem, I'm just going to kind of move this around as I read this slide. My research problem, the purpose of this research is to investigate the causes behind disproportionately higher discipline referral rates and exclusionary practices for Black students as compared to white students. I do want to put this out here. You'll kind of see this throughout this presentation that this research study would be conducted in my classroom. The context would be Black and white students within my own classroom, just because I felt that that would probably be the most practical sense of collecting data. So, what are my three research questions? One, does research state that Black students engage in different rates of behavioral infractions as compared to white students? I think that that is a really important question to answer when you talk about disproportionately higher discipline referral rates and then the use of exclusionary practices, because you want to know, well, is it disproportionate? Are more behavior infractions being committed? And research shows that no, there is not a higher rate of um, behavior infractions for Black students as compared to white students. My second research question, are Black and white students receiving equal discipline practices for the same behavioral infractions? And I guess you can kind of already guess that, again, research shows, unfortunately, no. And I will kind of get into that with the findings from the articles that I selected for this presentation. How are teacher biases and perspectives affecting discipline referral rates and exclusionary practices for Black students? I think that when we talk about why is this happening, we really need to delve into teacher biases and perspectives, because it's clear that they are the ones who are referring behavior infractions, and then they're involved in the use of non-exclusionary and exclusionary practices for Black and white students. So I think you really have to understand why it's occurring. All right, my context and unit of analysis. My contexts are white and Black students within my classroom. The unit of analysis would be the number of discipline referral rates and exclusionary practices used between these groups. All right, there are 6 different types of data being collected in this research study. So I'm going to start with number 1, discipline referrals and exclusionary practices used for Black and white students for the 2021-22 school year. That would have been this school year that just kind of wrapped up. The second type of data being collected are discipline referrals and exclusionary practices used for Black and white students for the 2022-23 school year. Third, when an exclusionary practice was used after a discipline referral was made for Black and white students. Instances of non-exclusionary practices for Black and white students. So non-exclusionary practices are, teacher warnings to student, teacher warnings home to families, kind of stepping in, intervening prior to, giving a kid an out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension. Fifth, use of restorative practices for Black and white students, right? Like proactive, restorative, let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about what you could do in the future. It's teaching expected behavior. And these restorative practices are proven to be effective. And lastly, attempts or initiatives to establish one of the 4 elements of psychological sense of community. What are one of those 4 elements? Well, I have them all listed here. Membership in a group, emotional connection, influence, and needs fulfillment. So 6 different types of data would be collected, and the methodology would be then to compare all this data that's being collected. So I'll start with the first part of my methodology. Compare the number of discipline referral rates for Black and white students from the 2021-22 school year with discipline referral rates from the 2022-23 school year. I would like to see all discipline referral rates decrease, right? That's the overall goal. But I want to see a more equalized number in discipline referral rates during the 2022-23 school year as compared to this prior year, because I would be implementing the new behavioral methods such as non exclusionary practices, restorative practices, and psychological sense of community. Next, I will compare the number of exclusionary practices for Black and white students from the 2021-22 school year with the 2022-23 school year. Again, I want to see all exclusionary practices decrease, but the most important and why I'm really doing this research study would be to equalize, have comparable data of the use of exclusionary practices for Black and white students, during this 22-23 school year, because there are new behavioral methods taking place. Restorative practices, non-exclusionary practices, all of those can decrease the use of exclusionary practices. Lastly, I will compare the usage of non-exclusionary practices, restorative practices, and elements from psychological sense of community between Black and white students to determine if I provided the same opportunities for Black and white students and if it correlates to the findings above. I think that this step is actually the most crucial, because if I find that the rates of discipline referrals and exclusionary practices aren't decreasing or becoming equalized in the 22-23 school year, I might not know why. But I think that this step provides context to understand, well, what if something went wrong? Maybe I wasn't providing equal opportunity. And if not, let's find out where. Was it non exclusionary practices, restorative practices, elements from psychological sense of community? Or possibly, if I was providing equal opportunity, are these methods not effective in my classroom? What do I need to do to change? All right, the articles of focus. These are the three that I kind of pulled from. I wanted to pull one piece of data from each of these articles because my research questions are all kind of focused on different things. Yes, they all relate to the same topic, but I pulled one piece of data from each of these three articles. Findings from data. So, discipline inequities. I put this right at the top. This is why I wanted to conduct this research study. So, here is a piece of information from one of the articles. African American students and Hispanic students are punished more harshly than white students at the same number of infractions in a school year. I thought that was a really interesting piece of information. Even if the same infraction or same number of infractions um, are done by Black and white students, Black students are punished more harshly, given longer discipline consequences or straight to exclusionary practices. Psychological sense of community was shown to have a positive direct association with perceived school belongingness, and school belongingness was negatively linked to depressive symptoms. Moreover, psychological sense of community had a negative direct relationship with risk behaviors. So, what I really pulled out of this was negative direct relationship is great, right? If you have high rates of psychological sense of community, you have low rates of risk behavior, and vice versa. If you have a really low psychological sense of community, you're going to have higher risk behaviors. So that kind of answers, like, why do we see high risk behaviors? Well, kids don't feel like they belong, and they could be depressed, which is what's going on in this quote from the article. Is that by trying to establish psychological sense of community, I'm trying to decrease risk behaviors, but also provide them with school belongingness. So it kind of benefits them in more than one way. And lastly, exclusionary practices. After being referred for such infractions, Black students are 2.5 times as likely as their white peers to receive exclusionary discipline practices for these infractions. So, Black students are more likely to suffer from exclusionary practices than their white peers for the same referral of discipline infraction. So, yes, there is bias coming into play here. And then I provided like a works cited page that if you wanted to find any more information or see where these quotes came from, the findings, they are all here. And I put a last little thought. I wanted to leave you with what my goal is from this research study. If this were to be implemented, my goal would be to decide if implementation of these new practices, so these new practices are non exclusionary practices, restorative and proactive interventions, and creating psychological sense of community if those behavior methods lead to an equalized number of discipline referral rates and the use of exclusionary practices between Black and white students. And that is it. Thank you.